Good morning, everybody. David McLeod here, coming to you from Belmont, California. My buddy and my co-host, Tommy Stoffel, is on vacation right now. He's off in India with his wife on some kind of a pilgrimage and family gathering and all kinds of cool stuff. So he'll be away this week and next week. But I've invited my good friend and a very wise woman, Beata Lewis, to join us today. And we're going to be talking about a really, really interesting topic on the subject of shadow. Good morning, Beata. Welcome to the show. Good
morning. Thank you, David. I'm very happy to be here.
Yeah. So this whole idea of shadow, it's an amazing topic. And I know that probably everybody has some idea of what shadow actually is. But I think in order to be clear what we're talking about, probably we should start by having a little bit of a discussion about what we think shadow is and where it comes from and all that kind of stuff. Let me ask you, what's your perspective on that? Where do you think shadow comes from? What does it really mean?
Well, let's just imagine you're sitting at the beach and there are all these really interesting rocks in front of you, right? And instead of those being rocks, those are characteristics of a human being, like loving or aggressive or intelligent or stupid or whatever. And you take each individual rock and you say, this is me, this is not me. And there's eventually a pile of me and there's a pile of not me. And the problem with all of those rocks is they all belong to you no matter what. You can't get rid of any of these rocks. And so this is your personal beach and you've just divided them up into, me, not me. And there's an ego identification with me, the sort of curated avatar self that we all want to be. And then there's the aspects of self that we don't want to own, including things that we think are negative, and also things that we are sure are positive that we don't embody and that we may be scared of, or, so that's a stretch. I'm not that great.
Yeah, right. I really like that metaphor. That's a really cool idea. And in fact, I like the idea of rocks because rocks have weight. Yeah. Rocks have density. And interestingly enough, as you say, no matter where we put those rocks, we got to carry them around with us all the time. It's just that the ones that we push off to the side, the ones that we say, this is not me, those are the ones that we kind of hide in a little bag that we kind of carry over our shoulders, and maybe we don't even know we've got it there, or maybe it's wrapped around our waist and we just kind of trudge along with it, or something like that. But I think a deeper point here that I would like to just raise awareness on is that I don't think if we were all by ourselves on this beach, I don't think we would be quite so inclined to make that division. I think it is because of the fact that we have interactions with other human beings who happen to also be on the beach, who we see behaving as if they don't like this thing over here that I see as myself, and so I try to hide it. I try to hide it from that person. That's really where I think the notion of shadow comes from. We take something when we're very young, we say, oh, mommy doesn't like this, daddy doesn't like this, so I have to make mommy and daddy happy, so I'm going to try and hide that piece and push it in the background. The problem is, as we get older and older, we forget that we did that. And meanwhile, we wonder why certain behaviors show up in our life as we get older and say, my God, that's just not like me. That's not me. I made that decision years ago. So that's the kind of dynamic that we end up creating when we make that division and put one pile of rocks in one place and the other pile of rocks in the other.
Yeah, I really like that. And there are two things that I'd like to say about what you've just illuminated. One is a distinguishing feature of human beings is that we're meaning makers.
Yeah.
We make up what we're perceiving means. And that means we make up a story about our own identity, and we make up a story about the whole world, and we're constantly in this process of meaning making.
Absolutely.
A second thing is that we have no matter who you are as a human being, you have core needs. Two of them are love and belonging. And so we have different strategies for getting love and belonging in different contexts and with different people. But it's this interaction, as you say, we're not here alone. No human is an island. And then the third thing that actually goes with that is that the whole process apparently is subconscious. It's not at the conscious level. And the very term of shadow comes from Carl Jung, who basically was identifying an archetypal quality that all humans share, which is that this way that we create an individuated identity, and what becomes conscious awareness and what's unconscious awareness. And he basically said, what you bring to consciousness, you can do something about. And what is in an unconscious level will run you, but it will run you in a way that maybe you wouldn't choose. And that's what I find so interesting about the whole notion and all the dynamics around shadow, is that it's this process of making it conscious. It's not a process of making it go away.
Exactly. Yeah, that's very, very true. I've been studying this whole concept of shadow for probably 15 years in a dedicated way now. And I absolutely agree with everything you've said. It really is an amazing thing. What I have learned in my study of shadow is that ultimately every shadow is underpinned at its lowest level by some unconscious belief that we have. And usually the belief is a negative belief about ourselves or a negative belief about the world that we live in. And so consequently, and you use this word, strategy. What we do is we look for a strategy that makes it possible to live in this world that we imagine based on those beliefs that we have. And so sometimes we take aspects of ourselves, behaviors, characteristics, whatever you want to call them, and we say, oh, that won't allow me to strategize getting this love and belonging, so I have to put it in the background. But then, you see, we forget that we've done that. I think that at some level, we do make the decision consciously, but after we've made the decision, we say, oh, this strategy works great, then we forget about it. And then it stays in the unconscious, and it does run, or as I sometimes say, I add in a little I in there, it ruins our lives if we give it freedom to do what it wants to do. So really today, what we're talking about is the dance of our own inner shadow, those parts of ourselves that we have chosen for whatever reason to deny, to disown, to disavow, to hide, or to repress, because we think they're unacceptable or inappropriate or just plain bad or wrong. And what happens is they still live within us, even though we think we've done a good job of hiding them. And guess what? Other people can see them really easily. That's an amazing thing.
It's a really rich and complex inquiry, how shadow really plays out in our individual and collective lives. And one of the things that I appreciate from the image that you chose for this conversation today comes from Indonesian shadow dancing puppets. And what's really cool about the shadow dancing puppets is that you just literally see the shadow. You don't see the puppet itself. Yeah. You also don't see who's pulling the strings and and the rods for these puppets. You just see the shadows dancing.
Yeah.
And that's a really strong metaphor for the shadow dynamics that we're talking about, because you don't necessarily see what's running the show. You see the effect of it. And I work with individual leaders and leadership teams, and I'm working with people who've chosen to make a difference through business. Mm-hmm. And one of the ways that we work with shadow dynamics in our professional lives is when we consider the distinction between intention and impact, right? And so, well, I intended A, but impact was B. And then you can, unpack what happened. But if you go to another level, there's the level of, did I even have an intention when I took action, right? Was there a conscious intention? And then there was the impact, and do I know what that is? And there's another one. I had a conscious intention, and it was whatever it was, but really the driver was an intention that was below the surface, and that intention created the bulk of the impact over here. So it's not as simple as this duality of I intend and this is the impact, and I'll just unpack, this simple dualistic thing. It is multi-layered, and that's what makes it so interesting, but also quite frustrating, because people want to get it right and they want to do better, and it's really a process of becoming more and more self-aware, and also more honest, more willing to have the courage to say, that was me too. That was me doing a thing that I wish I hadn't done, and now I'm going to do what I can to undo it. That's very, very hard for a lot of people, all of us, to do.
Yeah, and you already mentioned, it takes courage. It takes bravery. It takes a willingness to say, okay, I am solid enough and grounded enough in myself to be able to recognize that there are certain aspects of me that maybe I don't like so much, and maybe I'd like to find a way of healing them. And this is something that I have learned for myself. When I first started doing shadow work, when I first started looking at my own shadows, I was terrified. Yeah. I didn't want to look at that stuff. I knew that if I looked at something, if I brought something into the open, then you would see it. And I was thinking in mind, wow, if I let you see that, then you're going to hate me. You're going to never have anything to do with me. Well, what I discovered, much to my surprise, and it was very counterintuitive, was the more I revealed the truth about who I really was, including those parts that I thought were bad, the more people seemed to trust me and be able to be drawn to me. Yeah. That blew my mind. Yeah. It really blew my mind. And so that helped me to gain even more courage, to look even more deeply at even more subtle shadows over time. Now, as you mentioned, Beata, shadows don't go away. They're parts of ourselves. But what happens is, if we take the time, the energy, and allow ourselves to have the courage to step through our fear, we can learn a huge amount about ourselves. And the other thing is, every one of those shadows has its own motive. And its motive is also to create love and belonging. So really, it's just got a dysfunctional strategy for getting what you already want. So why not engage the shadow, find a way of loving it, embrace it, and bring it into yourself, and treat it like a little child that just wants some love. It's an amazing process and well worth the time and energy.
Well, and it's a process that is relevant to absolutely every relationship we can imagine, beginning with the relationship to self, and the relationship, just the idea of, is the world friendly or unfriendly, which is, according to Einstein, the primary question you have to answer in your life. Is the world friendly or unfriendly? Because everything will proceed from what you answer to that question. But what I want to get at is that the whole shadow dynamic sets up a permanent conflict in oneself. Permanent, as in never goes away. And so the conflict, we make it up between good and evil, and between right and wrong, and between me, not me. But there's always this inner conflict, and the place that you can say sort of how we're wired or how we're conditioned. And then the choices we make to transcend or move beyond the innate wiring or the conditioned self. And so a big piece of my work has to do with helping people with inner and interpersonal conflict, because that's the thing that we're all really, we have trouble with conflict. Conflict is trouble, right? It's a frightening thing. And but what's so interesting about this is what we're understanding even from the makeup of the brain is that the brain is designed to grow because conflict happens. So you actually, by tussling, the back and forth with whatever it is, that's how we learn and grow. So the shadow has a super important function. It's not that the shadow's bad. It's about making the choices of the now conscious choices of who we want to become. And if I can just add one other thing to this, there's a body of work about shadow that suggests that our relationship to shadow evolves over time. So in the early part of our life, it's about identifying the shadow, differentiating from the shadow. But then later in our life, it's about integrating the shadow, becoming a whole person instead of the split person.
Yeah. I love everything you've said here. This is really, really good stuff. I like the way this conversation is going. And, I see Sandy has just asked a question about shadow. She said, when you speak of the shadow person, I believe, are you not speaking of the unconscious behavior? Well, I think that's exactly what we said before. And you brought that up at the beginning of the presentation. And yes, it is really all about unconscious stuff, which is why, by the way, shadow is so hard to find. For me, it's very much like quantum physics. The physicist is looking for the next smallest particle. Well, we don't have the ability or the instrumentation or anything to actually see the particle. What we can see is the effect of the particle having been there. So we're always looking at a past representation of the particle, not the way it is right now. And I think the same is true of the shadow. So part of our work as individuals is to say, first off, admit I have shadow. That's the very first part. Yeah, I have shadow. I don't know exactly what they all are yet. I'm still working on that. But what I do know, what I have learned for myself, is there are ways for me to detect my shadow. One of those ways, well, maybe I'll share those right now. I'll tell you what I think are 6 primary ways that I can detect my shadow. The first is engaging in childish behaviors. Now, I may not know that I'm engaging in a childish behavior right now, but, someone can usually tell me about it, or I can get some kind of reflection. Pretty soon I can be aware of it. So, childish behavior, like maybe, having a temper tantrum, or, saying, well, I'm going to take my bat and ball and go home, or something like that. That's one example. And I think probably all of us have experienced that at one time or another. If that happens, there may be a shadow coming up there. Another one is just noticing when I get triggered, when I find myself in a reactional state, when I have an emotional charge with somebody. Usually that's because there's some shadow inside of me that is not comfortable with what I'm seeing or what I'm observing in another person. And so maybe my shadow will start coming out in reactive behaviors or something like that. Same thing could be said for things like judgments. If I have a judgment about a person, about a behavior, there's a pretty good chance that the reason I have a judgment about it, especially if it's a negative one, there's a pretty good chance that I have that very same behavior somewhere within me that I'm not really interested in looking at or admitting that's there. So that judgment, which I basically have projected onto another person, gives me an opportunity to see an aspect of myself that I may not have wanted to see. Now, there's a few others, but I don't want to go into too much detail. Those 3, I think, alone are probably the most common ways for individuals, for me, for you, to detect your own shadow. And I invite you to consider looking at those.
Yeah. So I really appreciate that you brought those out. And one of the things that we have to really consider is if what is the content of the shadow? And we largely think about it as a negative content, like the stuff I don't choose to be, like those would be bad to be. But it turns out that there's an additional aspect to shadow, which is the gold, the treasure of who we are, the not yet realized self.
Absolutely.
Right? And actually bringing that gold and integrating that into who we are comes from integrating, dealing with this me, not me conflict. And you know, our greatest teachers are the people who piss us off.
Exactly.
Right.
And luckily for me, I have plenty of those.
Yeah, plenty. And or make us really upset. And what I know from the shadow work that I've done over the many, many years is when you have a disproportionate response to someone or something, shadow is probably at play. And then it's this inquiry of, all right, what's going on here? So, you know, there's a lot of theory that we can talk about here, but I think that one of the things that can be really helpful is to have a way to work with it in everyday, daily life. So one of the things is we're constantly in conversation, yes?
Mm-hmm.
And so when we're in conversation, two people speaking at the same time is a cacophony and nobody's hearing anything, right?
Right.
But speaking out loud, but you know, the reality is we have two people speaking at time no matter what, because there's somebody speaking and there's somebody who's not talking, but the inner chatter's going on and on. And so there is this process. So to pay attention to how we're listening is an amazing practice, very, very profound. And one of the things that you can ask yourself as you listen is, am I listening to judge? Am I listening to reject? Or am I listening to understand?
Mm-hmm.
Or am I listening to connect? And the truth is, the more we can listen to connect, right? Understand, judge, and reject, those are pretty mental. But when you listen to connect, you actually get to the place of the heart.
Right.
Right? To this sense of why any of this matters. And that will start, you know, really, okay, what's really at stake for me here? And just listening to one's listening at that level can be extremely helpful. And you can identify, yep, I was listening to understand, judge, or reject. What would happen if I shifted to listen to connect now?
I like that. The idea of reject, judge, understand, or connect. I agree with that. That's pretty powerful. And I like your representation that connect implies the heart. And this is something that we're constantly talking about here. We're trying to move out of our heads. Not that there's anything wrong with the head. I think the brain has its own place. It's a very powerful tool, but trying to bring ourselves more into the heart. And for me, that's really about bringing compassion to everything that we do. Mm-hmm. And Sandy mentioned here that for her, the word shadow implies danger. It implies the boogeyman. And I agree that sometimes that is the kind of energy that we create. If you think about movies, I mean, almost every bad guy ever represented in the movies is always doing stuff in the dark. And so consequently, we have this perception that if it's in the dark, it must be bad. If it's in the dark, it must be dangerous. If it's in the dark, we have to really protect ourselves. And I can totally understand that mindset. But the real truth is, if we take Hollywood out of it, if we take the whole movie making thing out of it and just think about light and dark, neither one is good nor bad. Each one has its benefits. Each one has its, you know, there's danger everywhere. You know, if I'm not careful, I can stub my toe right in the beautiful sunshine. I could be on that beach we started on and step on one of those rocks and poke a hole in my foot. You know, So there's danger everywhere. Just because there's danger doesn't mean the world is a dangerous place. You know, I think it's a belief system. You know, I can recognize that sometimes, yeah, I gotta be careful when I cross the street. Sometimes I gotta maybe think twice about walking down a particular street in the dark, but that's not because dark is inherently bad. Nor does it mean that shadow is inherently bad. I think, you know, you've talked about this already quite a bit, Beata, about there's huge gold in there. There's huge gold, I think, in every shadow, no matter how it seems to be behaving. Because I truly believe that every action, every behavior that I engage in, that you engage in, is motivated at its deepest level by a desire to give or receive love. And if that's true, then no shadow is actually a bad thing. It's just found a dysfunctional way to get what it thinks it wants. So I think we're kind of in a really, really cool place now. One topic I do want to talk about before we skip away is what happens when your shadow and my shadow start playing and we don't know it. I'd like you to start that conversation.
Oh, good. I'll love to start that conversation, because that's where we're talking about the shadow dance. And if you think about literally dancing, you know, you can think of just boogieing on the dance floor all by yourself, or partner dancing, social dancing. I'm going to introduce the idea of the tango. And if you imagine two people dancing in that intimate way in the Argentine tango, there are a lot of ways that you could really get hurt. and there are a lot of ways that you can be amazingly brilliant and creative together. Mm-hmm. The whole point about the Argentine tango is that it is a partner dance, and that what you're going to express and create in that in that dance comes from the interaction together. This idea that the shadow is the boogeyman is actually part of our shadow. So the opportunity is to step into this like, okay, I'm going to learn how to dance with this better, not stand on the feet of my partner and not get trod on by my partner, but the dance of it. How do I learn to dance with this partner, taking care of myself, being, you know, whole in my own right, and you're whole in your own right, and we're going to dance. And we're going to create something better than just dancing alone.
Right, right. Yeah, I think that's really the ideal, and that's the direction we're trying to move in. I think that's ultimately all of us want to learn to dance with one another. I think my concern is, and part of the problem that I see is when my shadow starts acting up and I'm not aware of it, and it starts dancing with your shadow when it's not aware of it. And meanwhile, here we are thinking that we're communicating with one another, but our shadows are getting in the way. My shadow's all triggered about something, and so what comes out of my mouth is something that I really hadn't intended. And so what's happening is my shadow is interacting with your shadow. And that's where the potential danger is. The way to stop that is somebody has to say, whoa, shadow dance. This is what's going on. Someone has to become aware and be willing enough to say, all right, I'm triggered. I think you're triggered too. I think we're not really hearing each other. I don't think we're dancing as conscious adults now. I think we're allowing our shadows to interact with one another. And that takes bravery. As you mentioned earlier, Beata, it takes a little bit of courage. It takes a willingness to acknowledge that, hey, I have an aspect of myself, maybe of arrogance, that is triggering you for something, for some reason, you know? Or maybe you have this behavior of wanting to be right, or maybe that's the same thing, I don't know. And it's triggering me. I don't know. Whatever the case is, yeah. Let's just be honest about it. You know, let's just say, this dance really isn't working for me right now. I'd like to make some shifts and see what we can do to get to improve this. It really takes courage, it takes awareness, and it takes a willingness to be able to accept what's true about myself and about you.
This is why collaboration is so interesting and so necessary and often so complex and hard, because we are all humans in this and we're all works in progress in this. And to the extent that we actually choose to become more conscious and more deliberate and more and have a practice of embodied self-awareness here and then in the interaction, then there's more potential available in the collaboration. There's more creativity available in the collaboration. And mostly the collaboration crashes have to do with people who just wouldn't go there.
Right.
Wouldn't go there.
Mm-hmm.
And there are many reasons not to go there. Not all of them are wrong. And, you know, there are many reasons not to collaborate. And when we really choose to collaborate, it's, you know, like any intimate relationship, you think you've got it, you've got each other figured out, and then, wow, come to find, I've got this aspect of myself that I'm only becoming familiar with, and I'm only starting to befriend, and who did I get in relationship with? Who are you now?
Exactly.
It's an evolving process.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Well, Beata, we've reached the end of our time here, and I want to just say thank you so much for coming on and sharing your brilliance and your wisdom with us. I've really enjoyed having this opportunity to talk with you. I think we've had a very, very rich discussion with lots of good stuff. I hope that our subscribers, I hope you folks get some benefit out of this, and maybe share some of this with your friends. Meanwhile, next week, Tommy again is going to be away on vacation, so I have another guest showing up, Tara Janelle Walsh, author of the book Soul Courage, and we're going to be using that title as the title of our episode. It's going to be really powerful. It's going to be a lot of fun, so I hope you'll join me next week. Bye-bye now.
Bye, thank you.